So maybe not this semester, but generally speaking, you've collected all your data, you've done your analysis, you've got it all ready. What do you do now? How do you tell people what you've done? In particular, how do you tell them what you've done about your methods? What you've done about your theory, what you've done about your conclusions, all that's on you. But for now, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you're supposed to do with this once you get to the end point. I've hit on this several times during the semester that, it's a really good practice to sit down and think about those methods when you're reading them in an article or something. Think about how it is they're constructing their methods and how it is they're presenting those methods. I think that's not the easiest, maybe, but the most effective way of making sure that you're writing your own methods well when you're presenting them to someone else. But I've also stressed that this is a just so presentation, that you shouldn't trust that the order in which the article is written, the traditional, social scientific research report, which has maybe a very brief introduction, the literature review, the transition into a research question, and the methods section, the findings, the analysis of those findings, some kind of conclusion, maybe with some limitations, and then the references. This is a rote standard kind of research report. I made the mistake when I was early on in my career of thinking, well, I'm going to be innovative and organize things in a way that's more intriguing, and got pushback from a lot of peer reviewers who were like, yeah, where's your method section? So how do you put that method section together? A couple of things here. One is I've pushed on this idea of making sure that your methods are replicable, and that is absolutely the case. And so your method section should be clear enough that someone else can do it. But that doesn't mean that it should be a recipe. In other words, it shouldn't just be do this, do this, do this, do this, right? It is still, like every other section in your paper, an argument. So your literature review is a review of the literature. It is also an argument. Your conclusion, obviously, is an argument. It might not seem as obvious that your method section should be an argument. You need to convince the reader that what you have done here is put together a set of methods that are effective in answering the kind of research question that you presented. So you need to think about that all the way through. How did you generate your evidence? What are or did you use the right procedures for the job? And can someone else replicate this? It's not just here's how to replicate it, but if someone else does it, are you presenting a compelling case that they'll end up in the same place that you did? They'll choose the same method you did, probably, because they're the best methods to choose. And then they'll end up kind of doing it the same way you did it. I'm going to talk this time a little bit about the methods, then a little bit about what you are supposed to do with the data as you collect it, not just the analysis, but how you're supposed to handle it. And then I'll wrap up at the end and talk just briefly about how other people may use that data and how you can set it up for use and reuse and what that looks like. So, okay, let's talk about this section for a second. You always start with your research design. There's going to be a tendency, especially if you're working with big data, to try to bowl the reader over by saying, here's my data, here's how many records I have, something like that. Here's the source of the data, for example, if you're using someone else's data or something like that. That's not really what you're trying to argue here. You're trying to argue a connection between your specified ignorance, the hole you found in the literature, and a set of tools you're going to use to fill that hole. And to do that, you need to be talking about your research design. What is your unit? What is your unit of analysis? What is it? How are you defining the pieces of things that you're measuring? What kind of study is this? What kinds of tools are you using? Is this an experimental study? Are you engaged in ethnography? If it's a combination, that's fine, but you need to be kind of specific about what it is. Is this a panel study? Do you have a panel that you're surveying over some period of time? Is it a content analysis? Is it so you need to be very clear about what it is so that people can hook into their brain about what they are expecting to see in terms of your research design. And then what kinds of inferences are you trying to make? I've been troubled by this sometimes because I'll be reading something and I'll have to do my own work to try to figure out, okay, why, right? What does this mean beyond this particular case? Are you making inferences about the structure of how things work, about how this particular sample or case might apply, what you found in this particular sample or case might apply more broadly to some class of things. So be pretty explicit about whether you're talking about some kind of causal effect, whether you found some sort of pattern that you think is useful or interesting, or a model that might inform later research, or whether you are generating new theory. That is, you're making a claim about how things work and you're going to demonstrate that. Again, your methods are going to differ a little bit depending on which of these kinds of causal claims or kinds of inference claims you're making. And so you should be pretty explicit about, here's the framework that I've developed to try to answer this question that I've given you. I've been very specific about the question I'm trying to answer. Now I'm going to be specific about the kind of model and the kinds of claims I'm going to be making and how these pieces are perhaps related. that should align with the question, right? Now, again, in the research report, it'll be like magic. You have this great question and your methods have aligned so neatly with it. In terms of actually writing, that may not actually work that way. You may have started out with a slightly different question, and it may be that the methods that you chose help to modify that question in such a way that it is highly answerable. That's okay. I mean, this is I guess a sleight of hand, but nobody's expecting that you wrote it straight through and came to the end and stopped. That's just kind of the narrative of the research report. So if you need to make sure that these align, and if they don't align, of course you can adjust your methods, but at some point it might be easier to adjust the question you're asking. It may be that your methods have only answered a piece of this question up here, and so you need to make a case for a slightly different question. That's fine. Nobody's going to see that. So you can make sure that things align, but you do need to make sure they do align. So rather than just jumping into, we collected 18 million tweets at random, you need to talk about this connective piece of your research design itself. Then is the time to start to talk about the data and where it comes from, the provenance of the data, which we've talked about it in earlier weeks. That is, where did the data come from? Was it API data? Is it archival data? Did you collect it from scraping because you couldn't get it in another way? What did you include? What did you exclude? How do you make sure that this is representative in some way? Can you trust the source of the data? And then once you have that, are you kind of, and when I say, can you trust the source of the data? I just said I have 18 million tweets, right? When you say that, someone who's done a lot of Twitter research will know right away that if you say, for example, that you have a Firehose account through somebody, right? Someone who's done a lot of research with Twitter will know that just because you have a Firehose account, and just because that may be the best kind of data that you can get from Twitter in terms of completeness, they also know that it is not complete, right? But you need to assume that they are not someone who does research with Twitter. And so you need to explain some of the limitations of your source of data. Even when it's maybe especially if it's a fairly good source of data, you need to talk about what may be excluded, what may be included in this. And then if you've taken the further step of saying, I deliberately cut off anyone that I could see was under the age of 18, for example, or I deliberately limited it when I could tell to those who were living in the United States. This is where you start to talk about how you've trimmed your data set from the outset, or, people who've deleted their accounts. I've removed anyone who deleted their accounts by the time of analysis or by the time of publication, something along those lines. If you're sampling, and there are reasons to sample and reasons not to sample, how did you sample? Did you sample by IDs? Are you trying to take a representative sample? Is this a sample so that you can have a time-based sample or a constructed week sample? For those of you who don't know, if I'm trying to figure out what's happening on Reddit and I want to use a week, a Monday through Sunday week to see how things change from day to day, I don't want to do that in a single week, because if I do, and something weird happens on a Friday, that Friday is going to throw it off. It's not representative of all weeks. So for example, I can construct a week as part of a sample by pulling from multiple weeks and collapsing into one, something along those lines, right? If you are sampling, and we've talked about how that may not be as necessary as it has been in the past, but if this is a sample, how did you determine the sample? Have you done something like bootstrapping where you've made sure that you have enough? This is where this gets into the kind of the question of representativeness of the sample, whether it's a large enough sample, whether you've tested the size of the sample to make sure that it's getting you the kinds of results you expect, right? And again, this is often constrained technologically, right? So there are a few platforms that actually incrementally add user numbers, so that you can, if you don't have the usernames, you can just search for the numbers of the user. That's very rare now, but it used to be more common. So you could actually sample that by saying, okay, what's the latest number that's gone out? We can just take random numbers in between and hopefully hit a fairly randomized sample of users on the system. If I were to do that, one of the exclusions I would make, in fact, I'm doing something very similar to this right now, is I would look at the users and look for anyone who had posted in the last 3 months or the last 3 weeks, right? I don't want to get moribund moribund accounts in my collection. So that's one of the exclusions I might indicate. Anyway, so you have to talk about what your sampling method was. It doesn't have to be long or extensive, and you don't have to go into a ton of detail, but you need to show that you've collected it in some way that maintains a representativeness, especially if you're going to use that sample to infer to a larger population. Third, operationalization. We've run into this in the past, but how were the abstract concepts that make up your research design translated into measurable variables, and what were the measurements of those, not the results, but kind of how were those variables measured? This is kind of, how are you encoding these observations into variables that you can then use in a comparative way, right? So this is where you kind of talk about, we have this concept of, some of you are talking about, well, I'll use my example instead, which is actually akin to what some of you are doing, which is I'm kind of interested in whether Reddit makes you mean, right? And so, what do I mean by mean? What do I mean by nasty? And so, maybe I have some dimensions of that: politeness, language use of evidence, responsiveness, shortness, punctuation, dismissiveness, personal attacks, whatever. Maybe I have some categories there, and then I have ways of measuring each of those, right? And so this is where I start to talk about the actual operationalization of conceptual categories, and then the actual measurement process for each one of those, right? Finally, well, not finally, but the final piece of talking about your data is any kind of pre-processing you did. So any kind of cleaning or normalization of data, or if you've taken out kind of extreme cases in some way, have you deduplicated? Are there data errors? Have you deduped the collection? I mean, duplicated records show up a lot in data. It's just something. In terms of redundancy, it happens a lot. I may have mentioned earlier that I did a project where we couldn't get access to the API for what we needed, and so we were collecting tweets without the API, and we were collecting them we deliberately did this from 5 different cities in the US. So we had a bunch of data that we then had to kind of slurp together and then deduplicate. So we would talk about that there. If you are doing some kind of machine learning, this is where you would talk about your tokenization process. Did you use stop words? Did you use a standard set of stop words? Did you use a dictionary approach? Did you stem the tokens? These kinds of questions around transferring textual data into something that you can use for analysis, right? This might, for traditional text. Did you do some kind of feature engineering in order to recognize features within, say, a video or images, right? So what is it that you've done to this data that makes it more able to be analyzed using various tools? Altogether, the reader doesn't need to be able to do it necessarily. It is, again, not exactly a recipe. I'll talk about that in a second. I'm really keen on recipes, but this part, the research report, may not be the place to get into that level of detail, but they should be able to broadly reconstruct what you've done so that they could repeat it if they were asked to. They may not be able to follow it step by step, but they know exactly kind of the choices you've made in terms of processing this data before you've gone into the analysis. And then the final piece of this, of course, is the analytical strategy. This is where you explain what you did with the data. How did you figure out whether it answered your question? Why does the model fit with this design? If you're using regressions, what assumptions did you make? If you're using some kind of a hierarchical model, why is a multi-level structure appropriate to this particular model? Are you drawing that from the literature, or did it just make sense in terms of what you had observed? Have you, anytime you're doing the multi-level model, the way you've originally conceived of it is generally a set of an assumption. So, why have you assumed that this would be the organization of the causal structure, or something like that, right? For ML machine learning approaches, or some kind of more computational approach, what kind of model are you? What kind of what's the class of the model you're using? Why have you selected that? How have you trained it? What was the validate? How did you validate your training? What kinds of there's an emerging set of standards around what you have to report in terms of validation, but generally, the accuracy of the model from the training data and the test data is a very minimum. But often people are asking for more tests than that to be presented. Again, that's an emerging standard in terms of who will expect things where. Obviously, this should all be in your research notebook, so that if an editor or a peer reviewer says, well, what's that? Did you do X test? You could say yes. Or if you haven't done it, you can go back to the data and do it very quickly, right? You should talk a little bit about, questions of overfitting, things about like predictive accuracy. All of these pieces, when you're dealing with machine learning in particular, it's tricky because it's a new area and readers are expecting different things, but you need to make sure that the reader can kind of understand the strength of how this model is being used to do whatever you're doing with it. Usually classification, but not always. And again, at the very beginning, I said you have to talk about where this fits in the reader's mind in terms of your set of methods. If you're using mixed methods, you need to talk about the sequence you used and your sort of justification. Again, all of this is an argument. Your justification for why you used these methods and why you used, did you do something more qualitative that then led into your choice of features for classification, or were you using that classification I guess in many cases, for me, it's and. You start with something where you're trying to figure out what the pieces are that are important, then you use that for classification, then use that classification to identify a smaller set that you engage with in a more interpretive way. I think I've talked to some of you about this already, this process of sort of going back and forth between the the nuanced tools of interpretation, and then back up to a more macro view that is enhanced by often more datafied or quantitative approaches. I think throughout this, your assumptions about the world are really key. We talked a little bit at the beginning about model, theory, model, operationalization. And so when you go to model, this is a smaller world than the real world by design. You can't do social science with everything. This is the whole, the 1-1 model of the world is Lewis Carroll and a bunch of other people after him that have talked about this idea that the map is not the territory, right? You can't do 1-1 models of the world. You have to have a model that by necessity excludes pieces and makes assumptions. And so you just need to make sure you're being explicit about those kinds of ontological choices about the world when you report the methods, so that for a couple of reasons. One is because it shows that you realize this, because making assumptions is required in this process. Making choices about what you're representing is required, but not knowing that is dangerous. So some of this is kind of like, yes, I know there's this other stuff that I've excluded. I think it's not important here. And I know this stuff isn't included. It seems silly to talk about the stuff you're not including, but if you don't, the reader is going to jump to that and say, do they know? Do they know they're making these assumptions? And so part of your argument is to say, yes, I'm making these assumptions as a set of choices. I think these are appropriate assumptions to make. I think these are appropriate models and reductions to be able to represent the problem I'm trying to address, right? So at this point, you've got the core piece where you've kind of worked your way from the question to the research design down to the whole process of getting the data and applying the tools. The last piece here might talk a little bit about how robust your data collection is. This is a place, again, where you start to anticipate the critique that the reader might have and do a little bit of expectation management around that and say, yes, I know, this may be changing. This is an evolving, all the kinds of limitations. You don't have to get crazy with this, but you should at least, again, along with your assumptions, this is where you start to build up this is an argument. You build up your defenses around the kinds of potential softness in the data you've collected. Nobody has perfect data. Nobody has perfect models. So you talk a little bit about the potential limitations of what you've got. This is not an admission of failure in some sense, right? If you do not mention your limitations, it just means that A, you don't know what they are, which is really, really dangerous. It suggests that you aren't really aware of what you're doing, or that you don't want the reader to know what they are, and that's also kind of dangerous for your own kind of credibility as a researcher. So you need to kind of be explicit about whatever these limitations are. You don't have to flaunt them, but you should at least kind of name check them and identify them to give the reader less to work with. Throughout, you should be talking about issues around governance, around ethics. And so this is always also another good place to kind of make sure you're highlighting that you are engaged in ethical work. The worst thing I've seen is this has been IRB approved. Boom. That's it. Anybody who's reading this in the US context, remember this differs from country to country, will recognize that it's been reviewed by an ethics board, because they just assume that the university would have fired you if you're working in a university setting, or the business would have fired you if you're working in a setting that has external IRBs. In the US, generally, the external IRBs really only apply, I think, in medical research. There is some talk around bringing it in things like user studies and stuff like that. But so far, it's mostly just medical IRBs because they're an expensive thing to run. But I was approved by a human subjects board. That again, we've said this throughout, is the very lowest pass, right? And there is some assumption that you have done that. So I don't mean, when I say talking about ethics and governance, I'm really talking about what the kinds of things beyond that minimum that you've done to show that you've considered this, right? Like especially when there are special concerns when it comes to the population you're working with or the data that you're working with. So we'll talk a little bit more here, as I said, in the second and third part about the what you do with the data beyond analyzing it, and then how you might share it or make reuse of it. And so that kind of is what follows in the next sections here. So when you collect data, you are archiving data. Now that's a matter of like practice, right? So when I say archiving data, I mean when you collect data, you're putting it in a place so that you have it and can use it. Even at a very basic level, whether or not you're planning your archive, you are engaged in the process of archiving. You're taking data, you're putting it somewhere, you're hopefully ensuring that it's safe. You're maybe running backups and putting them somewhere safe. You are hopefully, to the degree that this is sensitive data, being mindful about the danger of it leaking and that hurting the people that you're trying to help, or just demonstrating that you are professionally inept. So you're archiving whether you're planning to archive or not. generally speaking, that archiving should be much more purposeful than that. In some places, there are increasing expectations that you not only speak about your archiving plan, but you make that archive available in some sense, if possible, in some way, if possible. So if you're applying for a grant at a federal agency, and often for foundations and that sort of thing, they want to see a plan, a very clear plan of how the data is going to be handled at each stage. And there's some pretty standard things that you have to think about when you're thinking about data. Things like the integrity of the data. Is it being held together in a way that is proper and being stored properly? The confidentiality, are you making sure that it's secure, as I noted? And then some kind of reproducibility. Again, if you're going to be able to share it or have others collect it in a similar way. So those things are going to be true no matter what kind of data you're collecting. But increasingly, there is this expectation, not necessarily in the research report, but overall, when you're applying for funds, certainly when you apply to IRB, they're going to want to know about your archiving plan. And often journals will want to see this as well when you submit it kind of separate from the documentation itself. So you should plan to plan, I should say. You should kind of think about this structurally. How are you going to maintain this data once you've collected it, and what are you going to do with it at that point? Before you actually are archiving the data, you need to think about the sort of broad dimensions of this data. What kind of data is it? Is it a public data set? Are you using somebody else's data that's public? That you're going to handle that in a very different way than if it is a restricted data set that is collected by someone else, but that you've been given some kind of privileged access to. Is it confidential in some sense? Is this data where you're being allowed to use it, but you aren't expected to be able to keep it in any way? Can you do your analysis and then do you have to hand it back? Is it highly sensitive data? Is this data about people's health concerns, their psychological state? Does it have national security implications? What is the sensitivity of this data? Once you take the data, are you now a target for national level actors trying to hack your system? Like, this sounds odd, but I have to say, like, among my colleagues right now, I feel a little left out for not having a hit squad. I won't mention who, but there's been some people who have, maybe among colleagues that you've taken courses from recently, who have provided data-based assessments of things like international war crimes and presented this at the Hague. And when you do that, you get war criminals trying to track you down. Like, this is data that is as sensitive as it gets. Yes, national level actors are going to come after you for that data and try to get it from you, or try to figure out where you got it from, or try to find the people that are in that database that they can go after and kill. Right. Another person has done some work on sort of a peasant social mobilization. And again, there were credible threats of her being killed for that work by the government that was trying to put down this, not a revolt at this stage, but a social movement. And so, these, and I've worked with data that had to do with large white nationalist organizations, and with my own work on a peasant revolt. And so it is not uncommon for this to be highly sensitive in terms of, people trying to come and get the data because it is something that is useful to them to either destroy or to take from you. So that heightens the level of what you're doing when you're archiving this stuff, if that makes sense. Or on the confidential level, for a while, for example, Meta, Facebook at the time, they invited some 200 researchers to get access to data from the back end of Facebook. But the only way you could get that data was to go into a safe room where there was a computer where you could view this stuff, take notes on paper, and then walk out. But that was the only way you could get data, was to look at the screen there. You couldn't bring any electronic devices in. You couldn't record it in any way other than to take notes. This happens in other contexts too, with highly sensitive data, where you're allowed to either, in some cases, you're not even allowed to take in notes. What you see, you can see, and whatever you can retain in your memory, you can bring out. But in many cases, you can go in with a notebook, bring it out. You have to hand it to them to show them what's in the notebook. They can expurgate it depending on what kind of data this is, and then you have to do it based on what you've written down with a pencil and paper, right? So, these are edge cases. My guess is that most of you will never have to deal with that. Although I have. My spouse is a lawyer who's been in a situation where they were not having to do with national security, but working with a company that required the same. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, to be sure. Does this data that you've collected contain direct identifiers? These are things like names, email addresses, or physical addresses, or social security numbers or telephone numbers. Any personally identifiable information, is that in the data? Because that's going to change how you can handle it. Does it contain some kind of indirect identifier? Some kinds of IP addresses, locations, timestamps, physical attributes, waist size. Doesn't seem like, so any one of those by themselves means nothing at all. But I think we've talked a little bit about this. Once you start to combine those things, it's fairly easy to re-identify someone. So it doesn't contain these indirect identifiers that you, again, are a little bit more sensitive, and you have to think about how you're going to maintain the confidentiality of that material. Even before you collect these data, you have to think about the risks involved and how you're going to mitigate against those risks. Again, when you apply for if you're going to the IRB, if it's something that you need to go to the IRB for, they're going to ask you for a data plan. And so you have to have that in place, but you should be thinking about those risks from the outset. When it comes to writing the report, in the research report itself, you need to talk a little bit about how the data was maintained. But as I said, a lot of journals will ask for that separately, along with the archive data if they're requesting archive data. So the data plan piece of it is something that a lot of journals are now asking for. And certainly when you apply for funds from a funding agency, and then when you report your activities, they're asking for that kind of process as well. What do you do once you have the data? Again, this is part of your plan. Are you de-identifying the data in some way? Now, what does de-identification mean? For a lot of what we do, there's no reason for us to actually know their names. We don't want to connect it to other data later. We're making use of this data as it is. So that means removing the direct identifiers if you can. Attaching numbers to each of the records and taking out names, the things we talked about before, social security numbers, phone numbers. That's an obvious first pass, right? We need to remove those or expurgate them or something. We'll talk about that in just a second. You also have to think about those indirect identifiers. And now, honestly, this is really tricky to do. We may have talked about the AOL search release and how easy it was to they did what they were supposed to do and took out the direct identifiers. There were no social security numbers. They took out any indicators of addresses or states or names or places. But there were enough indirect identifiers that you could connect them together and make a good guess as to who someone was. And so, not in every case, but you could re-identify dozens of people from the collection of things they were searching for, places they were searching about. Right? These shouldn't identify the person, but they do. Some people have talked about search engines as a database of intentions. Right? That when you make a search, that is an indicator of the totality of your intentions. So if you think about all of your searches over the years, what that tells you about you as a person, if someone could see every single one of those as a collection, it tells a story. And so you need to be thoughtful about whether your data is telling more of a story than you expect. One of the things you can do is engage in some form of pseudonymization. There we go. That is, replacing names with identifiers of some sort. So at a very basic level, especially if you're reporting individual records and not just collected records, not just some form of analysis. So if you go down to an individual level, it may be useful to attach some sort of a name you can use for that. So that's a possibility, at least. Do the same with some of the other location data or whatever else. So there are cases where that might be useful in some sense. Again, if you're aggregating, that's less important, but also as you're storing it, it's safer to both store it in a secure place, an encrypted drive. Ideally if you're working for an organization, that means not keeping it on your local machine that you're going to get stolen from your hotel room, but putting it on an encrypted network drive that is in some way hopefully protected by the organization as well. But then if you're aggregating that data, that is a form of anonymization for the reporting piece of it. It may be that you're storing only the aggregated data, right? So it may be that if I'm interested in something happening at a zip code level, I may retain the zip codes, even though they would be identifiable for an individual, but I may then aggregate everyone in that zip code into some kind of metric, right? So in that case, that's a form of anonymization because you have kind of aggregated to a level beyond the individual. It may be worth suppressing particular cases because they're highly identifiable. If you have a celebrity in your sample and you think they could be identified in some way from what you're reporting or within the sample itself, it may be better just to exclude that person as a single shot to take them out of the net. Again, if you're doing a large collection, you may not recognize that, but if someone else can re-identify it later, that's a problem. There is some discussion, and we've talked about this in the case of reporting sort of direct quotes before, about some kind of noise injection or perturbation of the data, or I don't want to say falsification because that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to maintain the representativeness of the sample, but you might if it doesn't matter to your analysis, you could mix up certain cases or combine certain cases. You could basically do a permutation of some of your cases. This is not something I've done, to be honest, so I don't know that I can speak to it, but I do know that there's a lot of talk about this for large for big data collections about whether it makes sense to insert noise into this to reduce re-identification. And I don't have an answer to that, but you should be aware of it as a possibility. So if it's something where you have somewhat sensitive data and you might be sharing the entire thing, I will I will leave it as an exercise to the listener, whether you need to look at some of these approaches to noise injection to try to provide some level of some kind of a buffer from re-identification. Now, it's worth noting that no matter what you do, re-identification is probably impossible to completely remove from the realm of likelihood. And I think a lot of this has, as we've gotten more and more data collected, people have realized that the danger of re-identification has increased, that the pattern matching ability of machine learning often will often kind of figure out what differences make a difference in a way that human observers cannot. And so even if re-identification is not possible or doesn't seem possible, when you collect the data and when you do some stuff to make sure that it is a little bit less, a little bit more anonymous, it's really hard to say that a data set is actually safe from re-identification. Especially when those data are linkable to other databases, re-identification is almost always possible. So just keep that in mind. Remember that there's a risk portfolio here. What you're trying to do is mitigate, and you can't completely make it safe from re-identification and the risks that involves. And this is a big one for me, and that is that when you archive data, it's not really archived if you do not have the metadata. The metadata is as important, or maybe more important, than the data itself. I've done some work on actually arguing that things like your IRB proposal should be publicly archived, because we have a bunch of data where we may even have for good archived data, we may have the metadata where we at least know what the headings are and a little bit about what the person was thinking when they collected it. In many cases, we have the paper that it came from, right? So that in some sense is a level of metadata, because you can, hopefully in that paper, we've done the things that I just talked about, and you've talked about the kinds of limitations and assumptions you made and how you came up with these measurements and then how you operationalize those measurements and then how you did the measurements, like how you datafied your observations. And that's the stuff you really need to know when you're archiving the data. So I guess the paper is one step for that, but I think being very clear about how stuff is organized is really important as part of your data. And honestly, that metadata is useful if someone else is going to reuse the data, but it's also useful for you. I have data sets just like kind of littering my archive that are going to be really hard to reuse, because even though I, as either individually or as part of a team, collected the data, because I don't have sort of a code book for each of the variables, because I may not know exactly how I sampled it, because I didn't keep the kinds of records that were necessary for when I went through and cleaned the data, that is, took out kind of outliers or whatever. Because I don't have the scripts that I use, like, right. If I actually did the scripts, did I do a good job of putting them in a repository and archiving the scripts so that I know exactly what I did? I may not be able to run those scripts anymore, because it may be that the libraries have changed or whatever, but at least I can go back and see what I was using. So a lot of these things that when you're archiving this data, we think about the items themselves, and the items themselves are meaningless. This is my go-to. I wrote a whole book that said this. The items themselves are meaningless without knowing the process of datafication. And so it's really important that all the stuff that we're putting in our research report also go into some kind of archival form so that they are linked directly to the data that we're storing. Otherwise, it's just kind of like detritus. I mean, it's garbage. It's data rubble. It's nothing without having that. It doesn't mean anything without having the process by which you arrived at the recorded data. So yes, include your paper, include the README files, but do a bit more here in terms of what software you used, what scripts you used, and include those, your notebooks, your collection notebooks. You can clean them up. You don't have to include all the stupid mistakes you made, but you do have to provide the process by which you arrived at this data so other people can use it. Ideally, that documentation is a testament to your professionalism rather. It shows that you knew what you were doing. Part of knowing what you're doing is knowing when you report you didn't know what you were doing, if that makes sense. It's also an ethical obligation to those who come after, right? You need to show them how you made sure that the data was safe so that when they use it, they know that it is safe, if that makes sense. And it shows that you're aware of the reality of the digital world, which is, storage standards decay. You can go through the list of different kinds of records of older operating systems and having to be able to try to recover that data. So it shows that you understand about kind of software dependencies and those change as well. You understand that, the very format of these files, there are image files that you have to go back and find kind of archaic browsers in order to render. I mean, this isn't even archaic. I grew up in the era of Flash, and it was hard enough to archive Flash for a lot of different reasons. This is one of the reasons it's dead, is that it was not it was not appropriately universally accessible, which meant that it didn't really get archived properly. But if you look at, for example, the Internet Archive, which also could not handle Flash, there's whole websites that are just blank because Flash is dead. And even though we can get kind of archival copies of Flash and get them into archival copies of, say, browsers, that's a huge pain in the ass. And it's probably impossible unless you know exactly when that Flash file was, or Swift file was recorded, right? And so all of the meta around it is of vital importance if you want to try to reconstruct some of these things. Boy, don't even get me started on gaming. Okay. Part of this plan is not just kind of how are you archiving it, how are you making sure it's safe, but a broader retention plan. How long will the raw data be kept in its raw form? Where will it be stored? Who has access to it? How will it be accessed? How is that access controlled? When and how are you going to destroy sensitive data? It's funny because I had like a macro that I would drop into my my retention plan, which was this will be kept in my office on I give my office number in a locked cabinet, and everybody had locked file cabinets. And it's funny because over the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen all these locked file cabinets leave professors' offices because we don't need to do that kind of retention either for student records or for research records. So it's not like this part is new. We've always had to say something about this, and we would shred records after however many years, but we would retain them for that period, both for potential audit, but also just kind of because we needed to make sure that as it was being published, we had backup of what we had done. So you need to talk about that. That becomes especially important with digital data because it can last forever. You can have a ghost of digital data float around. And so making sure it's both secure and then talking about when it goes down the oubliette, when it leaves the memory hole, when it gets totally deleted is a part of that process. And you can't really have secure data if you don't have a process for destroying it once you're done using it. That doesn't mean that's especially the raw data, right? So even if you're doing a long-term, very careful archiving of the data that has been in some way de-identified, that's different than the raw data that backs that has to be destroyed once you've done that. And so you have to have a clear plan for when and how that happens. That storage, as I noted, you need to think about things like encryption, things like making sure that you have data that's stored in a place that is appropriately backed up and encrypted. So these are the basics that you should be able to assume, but surprisingly not a lot of people actually follow their data plan and are careful about the data, which is really unfortunate. It's sad. It's unprofessional. It's unethical. So it's all of those things all bundled in one. So you need to make sure that you not only are forming this plan, but you're forming a plan that you can actually follow through with. If you're not associated with an organization that has some kind of encrypted, carefully backed up data, some kind of archival space where this can be kept, then kind of replicating that can be very difficult and expensive. Storing data well is an expensive process, and so you have to make sure that you've thought this through, and then that you can follow through with it. Then the question becomes about when and how do you share these data. Archiving has become a much more common thing. I've pushed very hard on a few different pieces of scholarly communication. One is, even though it's harder to do than I'm on, I guess 4 or 5 editorial boards for different journals, and only one of them is open access, even though I am dedicated to open access. So I understand that there are institutional drivers that take us away from that, but that's one of my hobby horses. Another is pushing for open archiving of data. I think this is the best way of ensuring that the data is reliable and that it is reused, and that people can kind of that we aren't abusing the populations that we serve by recollecting data over and over again. Like, the reuse is not just a convenience. In fact, it's usually not a convenience for the researcher. It is a way of serving the communities that we are studying more effectively. So now, at a very basic level, a lot of journals will require some kind of data availability notice. Just saying data is available upon request is usually not enough. Because it's not always true, and because it sets up some artificial barriers. Archiving on your website, which is something that I did for a long time, is usually not enough either. There are usually institutional repositories, and now some journals have their own repositories as well, where the data can be made available even after you're gone, right? You leave, the data lives on, which should be the way it is. So you need to think about kind of where this data might need to go and how you can set it up to travel, how it can be kind of boxed up and ready to go. There are public repositories as well. There's ICPSR has been around for a long time. The Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. ASU has an office that's part of the ISPCR. Sorry, I just did that backwards. I had a short stint in a job working for them, so I should really have this down. ICPSR. And ASU is a member. Most large research universities are a member, but they have very specific rules about how you would archive with them. But it is a public, open set of data sets. A lot of universities, as I said, are doing open data sets. So Harvard Dataverse does. MIT has an open one. I don't think it's open to outside researchers. Open Science Framework has one. So there are places other than your own institutional repositories, but most institutions have both a public-facing, often now a public-facing repository, but at the very least they have local repositories, usually as part of their libraries. That's where kind of, if you have sensitive data, some of that might go into the university internal repositories. Again, we talked about some of the highly sensitive data. In those cases, you might need to think about more secure systems. Those archives may have to be licensed in some way, depending on kind of the nature of the work so that it matches either regulatory concerns or kind of industrial securities concerns where they have special expectations about the kind of work you do. I won't go into that. I will tell you that this is not. This was for a university, but a university that did some work that was related to government work. And I've been to a repository where there's a man with a shotgun standing outside the repository door. So like that's a different kind of level of private repository than the kinds of things that are kind of hosted in the cloud by a library. So there are some other pieces around this. There's a rise of first I'll note that some of these more restricted repositories are not just for you to use it or other people at the university to use it. It's just saying that we need to know who you are before you get access to this, and that's pretty common. So there's open repositories. The problem with open repositories is sometimes they can be used for commercial uses that you really don't intend it to be used, and that can be not so great. So like if you go to Kaggle, there's all of these open repositories, open databases that you can use for just about anything, and I think that's a good thing. But there are cases where you would want to know that the person who is going to use it is going to use it appropriately. I will say that one of the cases of re-identification that was problematic was a collection of Facebook archives of students basically at Harvard University, at some university at a large private university in the northeast of the United States, but everyone knew it was Harvard right away. So already you've got really bad de-identification, and those data could be re-identified very quickly. But one of the things they said was the safety was that you had to tell them you had to show them that you were an actual researcher before you could get the data. And yes, that was a very, very low speed bump, but some of them are put on these kind of private repositories, but where you have to kind of show how you're going to use it, basically propose your use. That could just be a line saying, I want to look at this stuff, or they might require a small proposal before they will release the data to you. There is a push towards some synthetic data sets. Don't think we've used any of those in this class, but especially for instructional use, that's kind of cool because you can have the equivalent of a real data set without having to worry about issues of privacy because it's not real. So there is a push towards that. And there's also the possibility of sharing some of these data sets through places like GitHub, or there's some others that provide TOIs, ways of kind of having a persistent URI to access the data. So there's other possibilities here, both commercial and public, where you can kind of archive this stuff. And so why are you doing this? I have to say, for a lot of faculty and a lot of researchers who do this, they're doing it because they were told they have to, right? Like the national funders in the United States and the funding agencies and the journals are all saying you need to archive your data, and that's enough for them. They're just going to archive their data. But let's talk for a moment about why we're doing this. And as I said, I think it's in service of our communities, but more broadly, it's not just kind of recycling data, right? It's not just saying, oh, I'm going to make it easier for the next guy, reduce, reuse, recycle. I don't think that's ever going to be a data key terms, but like let other people kind of use my data and they can get a little further because of that. It's not that. It is a way of accumulating knowledge around data that you've created, right? So, I had a data set that even before I had normally when you collect data that's going to be shared in this way, the expectation is you get your first cut at it, but it was taking a while for me to analyze this. So I actually released the data before I had a chance to fully analyze and figure out what I was going to do with it. And very few people picked it up because I've talked about this, I think in an earlier lecture for this class, where I said we ran into a problem. This was data that was collected and there was a slight ethical concern with providing it openly. But before that, a colleague that is now a very well-respected researcher, currently at the University of Arizona still, a junior scholar, but kind of an expert in this particular area, had picked up the data and worked with a group of others and done a great analysis of it. Better, I will say, with some confidence that her work on it was better than what I either was going to do or eventually did do. I think it was really, it's very well cited, better cited than the work I did on my own data. And so it's not just kind of, oh, here, have some of my old data. It is putting it out within a community of scholars, all of whom can add their wisdom and their abilities and their insight to this set of data. So archive data let you kind of aid in a bunch of different ways. One is replication and verification. We've had a bunch of cases now where people have gone in and said, this doesn't look right, and reanalyzed the data and found that it was that there was a better answer, right? That something had been missed in terms of the way that it had been analyzed or conceptualized. Not in a bad way, but adding to that knowledge. Sometimes in a bad way, right? It's also been used to detect fraud. So one of the nice things is if you're putting all your data out there in the open, people can go through and replicate your work exactly and make sure that what you said you did actually happened. It's rare, I think, that that's happened traditionally, but we've had a bunch of really, really famous cases of recently of people fraudulently analyzing their data or producing data that didn't exist, sometimes with kind of really broad effects of like large redesign of a governmental system, a widely accepted sort of way of building forms, things you fill out based on kind of what seemed like really solid data that just happened to be invented. So there have been cases of that. And so it does provide kind of that, don't just trust me, bro, but here's the data. This is I have on my bag, which is over there. Show me the data, right? So part of making a case that you're trustable is by saying, yes, here's my case. Here's what I've collected. Here's what I've analyzed. Here's what I've concluded. Oh, and by the way, here's the receipts. So there is that piece of it as well. It also, aside from just kind of replication or applying a different set of analytical tools to come up with the same to answer the same kinds of specified ignorances that you've identified, there's longitudinal comparison. So some of that data, I mentioned that I have some data sitting in archives that I have not used. I think I probably will recollect that data now, almost 10 years later, and see whether I get different results. And so that's kind of cool, right? It's a bummer I didn't get something together with that data initially, but I think that one of the ways to recover that also, all the work that I did on it, but also because that's how that's kind of magical, right? Which is here, if I wrote up my analysis now with that data, it would be like, here's my analysis of 10-year-old data, and that's not cool. But here's my 10-year comparison, and longitudinal. That's kind of cool. That's like 10 years of work. So aside from like recovering your lost labor, when you're using someone else's archive data, it allows you to say, okay, have things changed since they did this? And so that's awesome. Like that, you can updating kind of work that has been done before and finding out what's changed is a really useful way of kind of leveraging those data archives. You can come up with, especially when you start to collect data from multiple sources and start to kind of use that in combination, that provides the opportunity to not just kind of answer the same question that the original author was trying to answer, but engage in both methodological and theoretical innovation, making use of those data. I'm not going to talk so much about sort of meta-analyses, but that's true of meta-analysis as well, right? Because, it's really hard to do meta-analysis when people have different operationalization of variables. But when you can get closer to the original data, you can kind of iron out some differences between different data sets. And so it allows you to do some meta-analysis that isn't just looking at people's reports. A meta-analysis is generally saying, what have been this happens a lot in medicine. Here's a particular medical approach to trying to help people with this particular cancer. And people have studied it in, there have been 25 different studies, 5 of which have found it effective. Can you go through all of these studies and try to line them up and see what this says as a whole? And so that is a common kind of form of meta-analysis, and it generally is based on what is reported in the article itself. But when you can draw on the data itself, it gives you a lot more traction to try to figure out why you are coming up with different answers from different people and where the nuance might be in that totality of research. As a final use, what we've been doing, right? These data can be used for learning about how to deal with data. So it's funny that I haven't actually assigned you any of my data collections as part of your research this time, but it's because there's better ones out there. So when you archive your data, you give the opportunity to other people who want to try to learn how to analyze data, right? So how do you decide whether it's usable? And this goes back to what you were supposed to be reporting about in the first place. So as someone who's collecting this data, you need to kind of tell people about the provenance of the data. You need to have all the code books in the operationalization process. You have to know about how they sampled it and what kinds of cleaning they might have existed, what they might have done on it. You have to know about the kind of context in which it was collected. When was it collected? Among what population? Where geographically or culturally? So all of those are things that you need to understand that these data are embedded within a particular context. And so when you're archiving, you need to make sure that context is stored along with the data itself. And then when you're evaluating it, you have to say, okay, are these data of high quality? So the provenance of data, where it comes from and how it was collected, not only tells you more about the data itself, but kind of whether you can trust that it is going to be a useful set of observations that can inform your own research. Presumably you want to use data that was collected ethically. There are some really difficult cases of data that may not be collected ethically that might still be useful in some way. That's something that that's on a case-by-case basis, but generally there are problems with that, right? But assuming you have all the documentation to show that the person that collected this data was thinking about re-identification risk, was thinking about individual and community harms, was thinking more broadly about kind of data justice, whether this was in service of the people that it was being collected about, right? Even if the person who originally collected these data was both engaged in that ethical process and reported that ethical process in a useful way, that does not absolve you. It's not like this is now certified clean data. You still have to think about it ethically as well, and whether the things you're doing to it introduce new kinds of risks to the people that are involved or the communities that are involved, whether the kinds of things you're doing with it were expected by the people who had their data collected about them, whether you're taking it out of that original context and decontextualizing it in a way that may involve their privacy rights or their basic autonomy, their ability to control how the data about them is being used. And honestly, there may be new legal frameworks that didn't exist when the data was originally collected. So you still, when you are reusing other people's data, have to engage in that. You have to think about whether what you're doing with it constitutes an ethical reuse of that data. To ensure that data continues to be reused, you need to think about sort of not just the ethics towards the subjects, but how you create an environment in which these data are shared, I guess, in comity, not comedy, although that would be interesting too, but in comity, that you are creating an environment in which the invisible college is continued. That means things like you should be citing where your data comes from, and if you know who the person is, citing them as the source of the data. So that should be a very basic thing, right? But it's surprising that sometimes it is not. So when you reuse somebody else's data, it needs to come at a minimum with a full citation of where it came from. Usually that means making it findable in the same way that literature can be findable by someone reading your work. So if you're using reused data, you need to make sure you're putting a pointer. This is through a DOI, usually like a permanent link to it. That's ideal. If you don't have a DOI for the data, then providing some way of tracking back to that data is the way to do it. So who collected it, when, from what repository did you recover it from? So you need to make sure that you're kind of giving the breadcrumbs for the people that come after you, and also, in turn, giving credit to those who had collected the data originally. There's been some talk about that, right? Like I'm in that unusual case that I just gave you of someone reusing my data and making much better use of it than I did, and much earlier use of it than I did. But that's not usually counted in things like citation counts or stuff like that. And so there's been some talk about how we can recognize people who might even collect data that they don't publish about at all, but who should be recognized for kind of the hard work of collecting those data. That's an open question still. But in any case, you should kind of engage in making sure that you're doing the hard work of connecting your reader to where that data is coming from. I will just conclude with some kind of weirdness of the current environment, right? I mentioned before that we have some talk about synthetic data sets and what that might mean for public exploration and that sort of thing. There's been some talk about both mostly automated collections of repositories that make connections between those collections. That is a really interesting kind of ethical conundrum, right? Because I've just told you that when you reuse someone's data, even if it was collected ethically, you have to engage in an ethical process when you're engaging with that data. So what happens when algorithms and repositories themselves are saying, hey, have you noticed that these two seem to be connected in interesting ways? And as I said, for whatever limitations the current forms of artificial intelligence have, they seem to be really, really good at making pattern connections between large repositories. And so a lot of the risk assumptions that people have been making have been broken down by this. Where I, what shoes I looked at last week don't matter as a single collection of data. It's when they get integrated that we start to see some really powerful invasions of privacy, to put it briefly, right? And so I think we need to be watching that carefully and thinking about what kinds of re-identification happen when AI does this, and what kinds of assumption AI might be making of us individually from the data that they're pulling from these collections, and whether we need to put in new kinds of protections to ensure that that is not as easy as it may otherwise be. So overall, I know it's 3 areas, right? Presenting your methodology, presenting your data, and then potentially presenting it in a way that others can make use of it, or reusing others' data. These kinds of practices, I think, are pretty essential. I will say that, and I've mentioned this before, and I've talked to other scholars about this, even though the presentation of data is in a research report is an argument and should be complete enough that a knowledgeable researcher could replicate it, especially when we're in an emerging area, I think there is a lack of detail that is unfortunate. We haven't talked here about kind of, sharing along with your data very specifically things like Jupyter notebooks. In some fields, that's already pretty normal. That's the expectation, that you're not just sharing the data, but you're sharing the notebook that you used in your analysis of the data. That is a really nice push in the right direction, especially if those notebooks are very well written and documented. In some ways, I would prefer to read the notebook than I would the research report if it's well done. I can imagine a hybridization of these two that would be really excellent. I think that particularly as we're emerging new methodology, having that detailed version of, cleaned perhaps, better language, more approachable, but of your research notebook is really, really important. When there was still a blogosphere, a scholarly blogosphere, that's where it would go. And so I've actually lost a piece where I went into probably too excruciating detail about going through the actual collection and writing of a paper from the very beginning through the presentation at a conference through publication. And I'm sorry, I've lost that. I've lost it with my blog, Talk About Data Archiving. I can't seem to come up with it. Otherwise, I probably would have given it to you guys to read. But that kind of work is, I think, really valuable because it gives you that context you wouldn't otherwise have. It provides a pedagogical resource as well, where not just like graduate students or undergraduate students, but other scholars can then say, oh, I don't know what to do with AI. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? We're all trying to muddle through all the time. It provides them with the steps to be able to do that. So you could actually say, oh, I really like this paper. I can follow through and actually kind of do that work step by step. And that can be my training wheels. That can be my pattern. Going back to the MEMEX in 1945, this vision of the future of the information sphere before electronic computing was really a big deal. Vannevar Bush wrote this paper where he talked about the MEMEX. And one of the ideas of the MEMEX were these information trails. And it would be really nice if we could recover that on the scientific side and have all of that, sure, put the research report out ideally make it shorter, right? Forget about the 5,000 to 7,000 or 7,000 to 9,000 word articles. Do it all in short form, but then provide the really deep detail and the data behind it for those who want to follow more closely. And I think that would be, if I got to remake all of scholarly communication today, that's the way I would do it. All right. Thank you.